Okay, here's how Miro works. See, it's amazing.
What's everyone doing at David's desk? Ever since marketing started using Miro's collaborative online whiteboard, he thinks all our other teams should sign up. Why? He says Miro's making his meetings disappear. And if every team gets on it, that means even less meetings. They're using Miro for brainstorms, mind maps, customer research.
So could we use Miro instead of having another 100 meetings for every round of feedback?
Yep. You can comment, react to ideas, even leave a recording on the board.
And what about presentations?
There are Miro templates for that.
How do you know so much about Miro?
I've actually been using it all along. I just used a Miro board to plan the best vacation.
Okay, I'm on board.
See how Miro users save up to 80 hours every year by meeting less and doing more. Get on board at Miro.com with 3 boards free forever. That's MIRO.com.
Get the home field advantage every time with Fairfield by Marriott, official hotel partner of the NCAA. Whether you're a student athlete working toward your championship dreams or your team's biggest fan, Fairfield by Marriott has everything you need to get ready for game day. From comfortable guest rooms to complimentary hot breakfast. Fairfield is part of the Marriott Bonvoy portfolio of hotels and official hotel partner of the NCAA. Visit fairfield.marriott.com to book your next game day stay.
The mistletoe margarita, the Scrooge driver, the North Pole punch. Which drink is best for the holidays? The answer? All of them. And luckily, you can get everything you'll need delivered with Drizzly, the go-to app for drink delivery. Whether it's classics like Bullet Bourbon, Don Julio Reposado, or Kettle One, or something new. Fruitcake flavored tequila, anyone? Okay, maybe not that, but you can get the drinks you do want to match any holiday festivity on Drizzly. Sending a gift to your family, friend, or coworker? Hosting some friends for an ugly sweater party? Restocking your bar? You name it, and Drizzly has you covered. Shop curated gift guides, get recommendations from experts, and more on Drizzly. So,
what's it gonna be?
Download the Drizzly app or go to drizzly.com. That's DRIZLY.com to choose your drinks today. Must be 21 plus, not available in all locations.
Welcome into The Verge, a show which covers the Baltimore Orioles minor leagues. The Verge is part of BSL Radio. Baltimore Sports and Life is dedicated to analysis and discussion on the Orioles, Baltimore Ravens, and the University of Maryland. The site has a team of writers providing coverage of those teams and houses live streaming content weekly. Join the conversations at the message board, like BSL on Facebook, and follow BSL on Twitter.
Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify. With Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, it's totally free with no catch. Ever since we discovered Spotify for Podcasters, we feel like having options like video podcasts and Q&A lets us be more creative on another level. I highly recommend you give it a try. Download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Welcome to On the Verge. This is Zach Spedden, joined as always by Bob Phelan, and hopefully in a little while, Nick Stevens. He is unfortunately tied up with a weather-related power outage, so we're going to get started with this episode without him. Hope he joins us in a little while. We're going to talk about the Norfolk Tide's break camp roster, but first, we're joined by a special guest on this episode as Director of Draft Operations, Brad Ciolek, joins us here on the Verge. Brad, how are you?
I'm good, Zach. Bob, how are you guys?
Doing good. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thanks. Happy to be here.
We're happy to have you on. So we're obviously a long way out from the draft, which will take place in July of this year. But where are you and your team right now in preparation?
Well, in terms of where we're at right now, we've done extensive work already on the candidates that we're looking at for the number one pick. We also are scouring the country for our other selections. Our second selection will be approximately around 33. We're waiting for the commission office to release the official pick listings. And then our third selection will be in the early 40s. So we've already done extensive work, in the Deep South. That's typically the area that opens up first: Texas, California, Florida. And now we're starting to have the Midwest open up, and very soon the Northeast. So we've done extensive work already. It's a long process, but we think we're in a great shape as of right now.
One feature that was introduced last year for the draft was that there was a combine, a player combine, and I think that's coming back for 2022. What kind of difference did that make for you guys in the evaluation process?
Yeah, the combine is a great feature that the commissioner's office put into place, and we got a lot out of that last year. A lot of those guys were already done with their season, so it was just one last chance to get them, see them up close and personal. Also, for us the opportunity to actually talk with those guys extensively, get to know them a little bit in an in-person interview. So we got a lot out of that process, and we're really looking forward to doing that again this year.
So across the Orioles system right now, there's a broad range of really advanced hitters, particularly college bats, that have come out of the last few drafts. But we've also been really intrigued by some of the pitchers you brought in with Carlos Tavera, Dylan Hyde, among others from last year. When you're scouting amateur pitchers, what kind of traits are you looking for?
Absolutely. So aside from just what you're typically looking for a pitcher, delivery, making sure that it works well, they can repeat it, they can command the fastball, locate their stuff. We also have a team of dedicated analysts, and one of their primary responsibilities is to go through and examine all the draft eligible college pitchers that we get extensive amounts of data on. They do a deep dive in their arsenal, look at pitch usage, sequencing. And, I kind of like to say that we have a certain flavor that we're looking for as far as a fastball. We're looking for a fastball that has, a lot of hop on it, some rise and some running action, and more or less fastballs that, don't live in the dead zone or the hitter zone. Basically, we don't want those fastballs getting barreled consistently. So in addition to that, we also like guys that have power stuff, power curveball, power sliders, two plane breaks, and also change-ups that are, used as a serviceable weapon. So if we're able to find something like that in a guy and checks all those boxes, we feel really good about ultimately handing that guy off to our development system and seeing just how much they can get out of their pitch arsenal.
Now, we noticed, and I'm sure a lot of fans have noticed, that it seems like mostly position players have been going early and then pitchers a little bit later. Is that because you feel like, with the player development in place and what you're looking for, that you can find those guys later on, while, the more athletes, maybe the more raw talent is found earlier with the bats?
Yeah, I would just say this. We typically do as much research that we can on every single player, regardless of position, pitcher or position players. The one thing I will say, though, that is our analytics department does a tremendous job of deep diving and looking at research and trends. And typically up towards the top of the draft, pitchers are a much more risky pick. So if there is a position player that we feel really good about and he's there for our taking, we typically will go that direction. However, with that said, we don't necessarily just bypass pitching. We do an extensive job, scouting it, researching it with our analysts, and we've had a lot of pitchers that we have liked in the top few rounds, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, they're plucked right before we can take them. But we also do look for those guys, as you mentioned, that are extremely good athletes that can play up the middle. And, if they are there, we feel really good about taking those guys.
And along the same lines, it seems like since Mike Elias came over, the team has been more selective when it comes to taking high school players. But when you have taken them, it's looked pretty good so far with the early results from like Gunnar Henderson and Kobe Mayo. What stands out for those guys that leap to the top of the list at that respective pick compared to, the college hitters?
Sure. So I think in both cases, those were guys that always had loud tools, and you always hear about the tools as far as the raw power grades and the arm strength grades. And both those guys stood out to our scouts as far as, the power grades, the arm grades. And both those guys, I think, also had another similarity is they got a whole lot better from the previous fall into the spring, and it was noticeable. Obviously, with Gunnar, we had the entire spring to scout him extensively, and his stock increased dramatically, and we were ecstatic to get him where we did in the second round. Whereas Kobe, it was a little bit more difficult because of the fact that we only had 4 weeks to scout him, but in the spring. But he was a guy that we, did extensive research on in the fall at Jupiter. WWBA always has a big, showcase tournament down there, and he was one guy that, I more or less asked all of our scouts to shadow and take a look at. And, basically he put in the work himself. Both those guys are avid workhorses. And, when you kind of see those guys take that leap forward from the previous fall into the spring, you feel really good about their chances in a pro ball environment.
It appears that we can expect to see the MLB draft regularly held in July versus early June like it used to be. What impact has that had on the draft and scouting process? And do you think that is a more beneficial timeline, or have there been some challenges with that?
Yeah, so I guess the one thing that I'll say about that, there's always going to be an adjustment period whenever, the draft date is shifted and it affects the scouting calendar. So just to give your listeners a sense of what we go through as far as preparing for the next year's class, we start working the day after the draft ends. There's usually a showcase going on down in Florida, which has a lot of guys coming in from all over the country. And, because with the draft being pushed back a little bit, it also kind of overlaps with some activities that are going on with USA Baseball, whether that's a collegiate national team or MLB as a partnership with them with the PDP League. So there is a little bit more of a juggling act. We have to be more prepared. We have to make sure that we're, keeping our eyes on the guys for the following year's class, but at the same time, not ignoring, the guys that are just finishing up playing, or those college hitters or college pitchers that are now in the Cape, if they're looking to get more innings or more at bats. So a little bit of a juggling act. I wouldn't say it's necessarily more difficult. It's just a little bit different in terms of how we prepare. And we also try to do our best as far as pro coverage as well during that time with the trade deadline. So there are a lot of moving parts, but I think we've done a very good job of staying organized and making sure that we're covered everything on all bases.
So in the last couple of years, we've seen the Orioles go under slot with their first pick and manage to spread their bonus pool around a little bit. Is that a strategy that you tend to base on a class-to-class basis, or do you think there's a little bit more to it?
Yeah, so I can shed some light on that front. First and foremost, you want to make sure that when you're in there with your scouts and your analysts, that at the end of the day, and when you're on the clock, that you're taking the best player available for your organization. That's how we function. Now, as far as, savings or going under slot, that's a secondary, that's a secondary proponent to that whole process. So in the case of, the first draft together with Mike and Sig with Adley Rutschman, obviously, there was a little bit of savings there with Adley. And, we kind of shaped our philosophy, our focus right after taking Adley. There were a lot of shortstops that we were intrigued by that were in that class, both in the college and the high school ranks. And we ended up with Gunnar, Joey Ortiz, and Daryl Hernandez. So I would say ultimately that the first domino that has to fall is you have to feel comfortable with the guy that you're taking with your first overall selection. And then you more or less map out what you're going to do with the rest of your pool after you make that selection.
Looking at last year's draft, I want to talk about Colton Cowser for a minute, because he was such an interesting pick for a lot of us, because the stats, the tools were all there, but the one thing you kept hearing was small conference. You had to be leery of, small conference school. How did you take that to account when evaluating him?
Yeah, so the one thing with Colton is, one thing that I always harp on with our analysts, our staff, our front office, our scouts, is having a history with the player. And with Colton, we saw him actually when he was a freshman, I should say going into his sophomore year with Team USA out of Sam Houston State. And the one thing that really stood out to me about Colton was, you guys have talked about it. I can't rave enough about how professional his approach is, even as an underclassman in college. He's a contact bat. He works to all fields, and he'll just find a way to get on base. He's going to take his walks, and he's not going to chase very often. So the one last thing that we were kind of waiting for Colton to come on, especially, with that Team USA, and it did his junior year, was the power. And, when you kind of bake in the fact that he already has a very refined approach, and he's a high contact bat, and he's gotten a lot stronger. I actually saw him a couple weeks ago down in Florida, put on some good weight in the lower half, and the power is going to come. So in a sense that there is some potential concern about strength, of conference or opponents, but we've seen Colton, perform consistently, whether in that, with Team USA or previously. So that really wasn't that big of a concern for us.
I spoke with John Rhodes last week for an article I wrote, and first of all, he made my job very easy, very engaging, smart kid right there. But everyone we talk to, it seems like everyone gets along. The draft class, like they have a competitiveness to them, but they also really enjoy each other's company. That seems to be just a trend we're hearing no matter who we talk to in the system. How important are those intangibles versus just the pure talent of these guys you're taking?
Extremely important. And I will say that as far as our scouts are concerned, they do a phenomenal job getting to know these kids, getting to know these players. You know, whether that's meeting them for the first time in high school and staying on them through their college years, or, you know, going to a scout day, getting to talk to them a little bit, and then following up with a Zoom call. So I'm a big believer in makeup. I harp on it consistently. And what I always like to say is, listen, if these guys ultimately don't end up making it to the big leagues, the one reason I don't want them to make it, you know, it can't be because they don't have good makeup. So we put a lot of time into it. We do countless Zoom calls in the winter. You know, we check in on them. We like to leave them alone as much as possible as they're going through, you know, their senior year in high school or their junior year, senior year in college. But we keep tabs on them, and, you know, we kind of build that relationship. And, you know, I think the byproduct of that process is kind of what you guys have already hinted on, the fact that they have a great culture down in Florida in the player development department. Everyone gets along, but they also challenge each other. So our scouts do a phenomenal job, you know, vetting those guys and going through that background process. And, you know, we're going to keep doing that, and hopefully we'll have the sustained success like we've already had.
So, you know, right now with the first overall pick in 2022, you've got the whole class in front of you. We know that can be a bit of an advantage. So do you feel like with this year's class in particular, it's a good position to be in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of talent at the top. There's a lot of guys that more or less could fit that mold for that 1-1 pick. And so far through this process, we feel really good about the guys we have seen. I would say right now we're probably around 6 to 7 names, and we're going to continue to drill that down as we get closer. But we are making significant progress, and we're really excited about what we've seen thus far. There are a lot of good players out there for that number 1 pick, and I'm excited to see, you know, what happens over the next couple months. And ultimately, once we put our heads together, our scouting department, our analytics department, front office, ultimately to make a decision who we think is the best guy for our organization.
Yeah, this year appears to be loaded with high school talent at the top of the rankings you look at outside like Baseball America. Do you feel like you can get enough data on those guys to justify theoretically taking one at 1-1 versus a college guy who, you know, you have years of information on?
Sure. So to kind of go a little bit more into that, a few years ago, you're right, that might have been a little bit more detrimental for a club picking our position. But over the last 3 to 4 years, Major League Baseball has done a very good job of having events and more or less putting these guys through testing and, you know, lots of other assessments, and share that information with clubs. So we do have an extensive amount of data already collected on a lot of these guys, and a lot of these players throughout the summer also play in Major League ballparks. So some of that data is accessible to us. We will look at that data in addition with everything else that we put under the microscope. So it's probably not as much as a problem as it was maybe 5-6 years ago. And with you know, the tech and analytics boom in baseball, it's affected amateur. I should say it's touched amateur baseball as well. So we feel pretty good if we do ultimately end up decide to go with a high school player, that we will be prepared and have enough information to make that decision.
I have to imagine that this year is a little bit different than the last 2 years because of where we are in the pandemic. 2020, you obviously had the season shut down. 2021, there was a lot of uncertainty in the lead up that carried over to the regular season a little bit. So how much different is it this year than it has been in the last 2 years?
Oh, man, the last 2 years. You know, I don't think there was anything that could have prepared anyone for what we've been through the last couple of years. But there is a sense of normalcy now. You know, obviously the numbers have trended down, and hopefully they'll stay down. And, you know, it's been about as normal as it can be for, you know, the last couple of years. You know, the last 2 years, we always had to keep in mind of a potential COVID outbreak. So I would refrain from sending scouts to maybe a location where there's only 1 or 2 schools and there's a 3 or 4 hour drive, you know, and they have to get to another school in case things were to shut down due to a COVID outbreak. So it's been a little bit easier. COVID protocols have been relaxed in a lot of places that we scout. And, you know, I would just say that the bottom line from the last couple of years is we've learned more or less how to deal with and work under these circumstances, like everyone else for that matter. So I would say that it's been much easier to get around as far as and see players. The only thing that's been a little bit of a challenge is now everyone has had a pandemic fatigue and they all want to get out and travel. So rental cars have been kind of few and far between. You got to know where you're going and get them locked in or you won't have one. So
we asked Kobe Perez this when we talked to him a couple months ago, but how would you evaluate our simplified theory that we came up with, that the draft is being used to raise the floor while the international signings are more likely to raise the ceiling of the farm system?
Yeah, I think you could roll with that. I wouldn't disagree with that. I guess from my standpoint, what I like to do, or I guess my overall viewpoint of this whole thing is I just want to make sure that when our first day draft meetings take place, that I accurately assess and give all the information necessary to Mike and Sig, ultimately so they can make the decision on what they want to do. So I would say that that's a pretty accurate statement. But with that said, we do like some upside picks if they are available. And if we can get them, Gunnar and Kobe Mayo and a guy like Creed Williams, who has very loud tools and more or less just needs some seasoning with our player development department. But in terms of what you said, yes, I think that's a fair statement to make.
That is something I kind of wonder is what is the communication between you and the player development like on your year-round basis? Because you're obviously sending your scouts out there to look at these players, but you have to know how they're going to fit into your system and have the trust in Matt Blood and his staff to get the most out of these players. So what is the communication between your teams like?
Yeah, absolutely. So that has been something that I've been trying to get them involved as much as possible the last couple of years. And I've been really pleased with the results. Actually, right before I hopped on with you guys, we actually had a couple of our player development pitching coaches on to take a look at some amateur pitchers. So we do, seek their opinion often, and it's increased dramatically actually ever since the start of the pandemic because of the fact that there was no minor league season and these guys were more or less sitting at home and staying in touch with the players, via the phone, via the internet. And I think it's actually been an extremely beneficial process, not only for us, but also for them, because they get more or less the opportunity to see, hey, this is what potentially might be coming down the chute. And then when they show up day one at Ed Smith or Twin Lakes, they know what they need to work on or know something a little bit about them already.
Yeah, that makes sense. And changing topics again, as we, everyone hopes that the rebuild starts to turn the corner over the next couple of years, how will picking later in each round affect the team strategy when it comes to the draft?
You know what? I've been asked that before, and I've been fortunate enough where I've been with the club since 2013. So we have picked down towards the bottom of the first round. And I would say that as far as your overall preparedness, nothing is going to really change too much. Obviously, the players that you're looking at will differ. If you're picking down further in the draft, you're not going to go and spend a lot of time on guys that are going in the top 5. You're more or less going to go ahead, see them once, file your report, communicate with our scouts and our front office members, say, hey, you know what, this guy's not going to factor for us, so we need to spend time elsewhere. So I think the process itself is more or less still going to be the same. Everything that's going on as far as the research that we do, it's just more or less a little bit different because you're not going to be scouting those guys that wouldn't necessarily go at the front of the class. And you'll be scouting more guys that will more likely be at your pick.
And I guess that's a good problem to have. That's where you want to be, right?
Hopefully, yes. That's where we want to be in sooner rather than later. Correct.
It would still be an incomplete grade, obviously, but as you get further removed from them, how do you feel about the last 3 draft classes?
That's a great question, and I never like to get too highs with the highs and lows with the lows. So obviously, the 2019 class, extremely impressed and happy with the results thus far. A lot of those guys are thriving, and they deserve a lot of the credit, them and our player development coaches. They put in the work, and I'm really ecstatic about what's transpired there. I'm glad that our fans are able to actually see, Rutch. I know he's going to be back soon, hopefully, but see Kyle Stowers at our Major League Spring Training game, see Gunnar Henderson, and see what's on tap for them, maybe potentially sooner rather than later at Camden Yards. And then the 2020 class, obviously very encouraged as well. Kobe Mayo made tremendous strides last year, and we talked about how excited we were as far as his potential and his ceiling. Hudson Haskin has looked really good. The last couple of times I've seen him down in Florida, and Jordan Westberg has been really dependable on both sides, both in the dirt and in the box. So really excited about what's happened the last couple of years. And, again, not to get too excited, but with how the lineup played at Delmarva last year, very encouraged by, those results as well. And hopefully they will continue to thrive in our player development system.
I guess we can get to some listener questions if that's okay with you. Some of our patrons had a couple things they wanted to ask. Vivek wanted to know, what advice would you give to anyone wanting to get a start in sabermetrics/analytics?
That's a great question. I think so much has changed as far as the job market's concerned in baseball. And, when I was breaking into the game, we didn't necessarily have an outlet, so to speak, like Twitter or, and having that outlet to get our work out there. So I would say start a blog, do your own research, post stuff on Twitter. A lot of, front office executives, scouts, analysts are always looking for stuff out there as far as research, and it's a great tool. There's also a lot of negative stuff out there on that, but, you can definitely use that to your advantage and get your work, showcased. And I've heard numerous stories. In fact, there's a couple guys on our staff that have been hired because of the work that they've put out there, on Twitter and some research that they've done on a lot of prospects.
Luke Seiler.
Exactly. He's one of them.
This is also a question from Vivek. Since you were one of the few individuals in the organization that's been part of the old regime, how would you compare your work in the Duquette era versus the Elias era?
That's also a good question. I think the one thing that hasn't really changed too much is our preparedness. I was fortunate enough to work with a lot of qualified and well-respected baseball men and cross-checkers, and they more or less showed me the way on how to be prepared each year and make sure that there's no surprises on draft day. Well, there's always surprises, but you know how to handle those surprises when they do come about. The one thing that has drastically changed is our infrastructure. D and his team do a tremendous job. We have tools and access to data and information that we just never had previously. So that has been the biggest contrast between the two regimes, just the fact that our internal system has been beefed up and there is a lot of information accessible at our fingertips at the click of a couple buttons.
And Chris Franz wanted to know a couple things about recent developments in baseball, like limiting the draft to 20 rounds. How do you feel about that? Is that frustrating, or you feel like you can still get the job that you want to do done in that amount of time?
Yeah, I don't, I would say that it really hasn't affected us too much. Obviously, the rounds are cut in half, so our player listing, or the guys we need to scout, has also been drastically cut. So there's some good and some bad with it, but I'm actually a fan of the 20-round draft. It actually allows me, myself, and our front office members to get a little deeper on some of these guys that we typically wouldn't necessarily have the bandwidth to do. So I do think that there are positives and negatives, as far as going from a 40 to 20-round draft. But overall, I'm pleased with the developments of that.
And he also wanted to know about the elimination of multiple levels of rookie leagues. How has that affected decisions while drafting?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we're not necessarily looking for fillers anymore. We're looking for guys that are basically just the best players. And it really hasn't affected my job too much, just because of the fact that, after the 20th round, typically you're trusting your area scouts and they say, yeah, this guy can go out and pick the ball up and throw the ball across the diamond, and he's not going to make us look bad. So it hasn't really affected my job significantly on that front.
And I just have one more question myself. Are you surprised how quickly the depth just filled? I mean, Mike Elias came in and talked about an elite talent pipeline, and it seems like that's exactly what's been built in 3 years or so. So is it surprising how quickly that turned out?
I would say that I don't know if it's necessarily surprising, because we believe in our process here, and everyone here is on the same page as far as what we're looking to accomplish. Did I think that the results and the feedback that we've been getting on the guys we've drafted and signed internationally would be as positive as quickly as they have been? No, most likely not. But extremely happy with where things are. But at the same time, we know that we're not going to be satisfied until we turn this thing around and we're in the postseason consecutively in consecutive seasons. So that's the goal. But to answer your question, we believe in our process and not surprised that things have taken off the way they have. Maybe just a little bit surprised, how quickly and the feedback and positive feedback has been.
Well, Brad, we really appreciate you taking the time tonight. It's been interesting to hear this insight. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it, guys.
All right. Have a good one.
Yep.
All right. Take care, guys. Thank you.
That was Brad Ciolek. So Brad gave us a lot of really interesting insight there. And before we get on to discussing the Tides, Bob, I just want to kind of get your thoughts on that interview.
I love talking to these guys, just getting, the more straight to the top instead of talking to, just in conjecture of ourselves or even these guys that I also love talking to from Fangraphs and Baseball America and all that, just to talk to the guys themselves. Yeah, they're not going to tell you exactly what they're thinking and they're doing, but you definitely get a good idea of, just the mindset and where they're trying to take things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always good to have the reinforcement about the communication really between scouting and player development, not just on the pro side and the international side, which we've already heard from Kobe Perez in previous interviews, but also the draft.
Yeah, these are the main ways that we're getting talent into the system. So, yeah, I learn so much every time we talk to somebody about this, and that's what I love about what we're doing here. Hopefully the listeners are as well.
And we'll transition now to the first break camp roster to be announced by an Orioles affiliate this spring, and that is the Norfolk Tides, who have put out a roster that, as expected, features some pretty talented players, even though a few key names are missing. So Kyle Stowers, Taron Vavra, Jahmai Jones, Nuciel Diaz, and Kevin Smith are among some of the big names heading to Norfolk, as well as some players like Rylan Bannon, Alexander Wells, Cody Sedlock, Caden Grenier, and more. This is a good group of players that are down in Norfolk, even though you don't have Adley Rutzman. Kyle Braddis is not going to be in the opening day rotation there, but you are going to have Grayson Rodriguez. So what are your thoughts on this group?
Yeah, it's an exciting group for AAA. I think we're, as Orioles fans, mostly used to AAA being, more of a depth place where just guys can be sent down and brought up at will when needed. We started to see that change last year for sure as the season went on, but this is a more competitive team. It's mostly the guys that were playing at Bowie last year moved up to AAA here, and I was surprised to see Kyle Branovich up here in AAA, and I love it. I think it just goes to show how confident they are in him, and he had a great season last year, totally deserves it, but a lot of big names, and I think you'll eventually see Kyle Bradish and Adley Rutschman here for at least a couple weeks to start the season. And I think it's going to be a stream that you're going to want to watch whenever you're opening up your MLB TV app in the evenings.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any Grayson Rodriguez start is a must-watch. That was the case last year at Aberdeen and Bowie, and it'll be the case at Norfolk again. And we'll get to him in a few minutes, but I agree with you about Branovich. I'm thrilled that he's going there. I figured that if he went to Bowie, it was not going to be for very long because I didn't really know what else he had to prove there. But this is a guy who I think we could see in the big leagues this year. If, the formula that he has for success last year works, which is throw strikes, have efficient outings, rely on that knuckle curveball as your out pitch, and hopefully that is still deceptive against AAA hitters because it certainly worked against high A and AA batters. And when you put that sort of mix in there, that's the kind of pitcher that I feel like, if there's a hole in the Orioles rotation in June or July, they're looking down at Norfolk and they see here's a guy that throws strikes that can give you 5 innings. That gives Branovich a real chance to reach the majors this year.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And actually, I would say along those same lines, that's what's most exciting about this roster for me is I guess your rotation will be Rodriguez, Bradish once he's back, Branovich, Kevin Smith, and Alex Wells. Any of those guys, I mean, they get hot, pitch well for a month, and a need arises, they're going to go up and get a start. Same with a lot of these bullpen guys. You got Felke Peralta, Blaine Knight, Cody Sedlock. They could also start, or they could make their name in the bullpen and easily get called up at any point. And same with the position players, which I'm sure we'll get to.
Yeah, absolutely. Some interesting bullpen arms there. And I do want to get your thoughts on Grayson Rodriguez. He really didn't have anything left to prove at AA. He dominated there last year. And for really the last month of the season, we were questioning, does he get that bump to AAA to get an opportunity to prove himself against older hitters? That didn't come, but now he'll get to go to AAA. What do you want to see him working on before we start to have that conversation that I know is going to happen this summer, which is, when is Grayson Rodriguez going to be promoted?
He's got to do something about that batting average fastball. That is his changeup. Oh, wait. I mean, it's a 70-grade pitch. Who can tell who to trust on that one? No, I would like to see just a little more consistency with the command. And I don't know if they're going to do it, but maybe let him go 6-7 innings, at least a start or two before they plan on bringing him up, just so he knows that he can do it. We all know he can, but just to go out and do it one time or two times before finally coming up to the majors. When do you think that will be? Maybe we could place bets on that. I'm thinking end of May, early June, personally.
Yeah, we'll have to get our official predictions in next week as part of our predictions. So when we have Nick on here, as of right now, I would say mid-June is maybe the earliest we see him. I'm going to guess that, he's not going to be stretched out in the way that Kyle Braddis is actually being stretched out, where he's going to stay in Sarasota for a little bit and then presumably go to Norfolk. But I still think you'd like to see him maybe go 6 innings a couple of times at AAA before you make that move up to the majors. And there's also that factor, too, of how is he going to adjust to the ball, which we don't really know what the ball in AAA is going to look like this year, but that has apparently been an adjustment curve for some pitchers. So I'm interested to see if he's really affected by that at all, or if he's affected in any measurable way.
Yeah, those are great points for sure. I'm just thinking if he's down in AAA just mowing people down with the low to mid 2 ERA, and you're watching major league games in Baltimore with the pitchers that might be doing a little bit less good than that, you might want to rush him up and get him up here. But for sure, I think you're spot on there.
Well, the bats right now, you're not looking at Adley Rutzman in Norfolk's opening day lineup, but you still have a really interesting mix. You have some players who are heading back there. They were there late in the year, like Grenier, Kyle Stowers, Yusniel Diaz, Patrick Dorian, who got a cup of coffee last year and will be back in Norfolk this year. You'll also have Jahmai Jones there and Taron Vavra. So 2 players that could conceivably be playing second base for the Orioles later this year are going to start off down in Norfolk. And I know for me that Vavra is a guy that I'm really excited about. I thought he looked good in Major League camp. And I just think that everything he brings to the table, the advanced plate approach, he doesn't give it bats away, good line drive stroke, and, defensive versatility is something the Orioles have worked on with him. I'm really excited to see what he can do at AAA.
Yeah, that might be one of the guys I'm most excited to see play. He played well last year, but just the injuries added up, and then he kind of faded down the stretch, but you don't know how much that could be attributed to injuries lingering on. He did look good in camp. You saw his versatility, could play second, could play center field. I saw him playing out there in Major League camp, probably could play shortstop in a pinch if you really needed him to. So, yeah, I think he's like a good month or 2 or 3 away from coming up and displacing the heavy hitters on the Orioles roster like Chris Owings and Rougned Odor. So, yeah, between him, Bannon playing third, and Jahmai Jones is there too, but playing second, maybe a little bit of outfield. It's going to be fun.
And this is also a good outfield. You have Diaz there. You have Kyle Stowers. You have Robert Newstrom going back. In fact, there's so much outfield depth here that Zach Watson is not starting the year in Norfolk, which I know for some of our listeners when that roster dropped today was kind of a surprise. But, we'll talk about Watson in a minute. But just for the players that are there, we saw Diaz perform well in camp. Stowers was certainly challenged by the Orioles and had his ups and downs in Major League camp, but we know he has a ton of potential. So, and Newstrom's coming off a breakout year, and I have to think is close to the majors. So what are your thoughts on the outfield?
Yeah, it's loaded. I mean, I'm a little surprised Zach Watson wasn't included here. I would have thought he'd be the starting center fielder in AAA, but if I'm happy for Johnny Reiser to get this opportunity. If you remember last year, he was promoted to AA a couple weeks before Watson was. So it kind of makes sense. And you're a Yusniel Diaz injury away from having Watson up, or a trade away from one of these guys getting their opportunity at the big leagues, and then Watson can easily fill that gap. But it's a very deep outfield for AAA. I think this is your starting outfield NDH on most nights. So I guess between Stowers and Reiser, they can share center and right, and Nystrom can sit out there and left and try to hit bombs over the shed again in right center field.
Yeah, and Reiser, I think, is a good fit here because he can cover a lot of ground in the outfield, we know, which you need in Norfolk. Showed a little bit of power last year at Bowie, and he did have a slump in the middle of the summer, but then got hot again at the end of the year. So I think bat-wise, maybe the Orioles felt like he was ready for this jump. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, friend of the show obviously came on here. Seems like a really down-to-earth, good guy. And, he had his struggles a little bit at Bowie, especially in the middle of the season, but I feel like he bounced back pretty well. At the very least, he's going to be a gamer up there, give you some solid at-bats, and play good defense, which is important.
We talked a lot about these two players in the last 2 weeks, but what do you want to see from Yusniel Diaz and Ryland Bannon there?
There's two things, health and a little bit of consistency. Like, Bannon was ice cold, lava hot for a couple of weeks, and then ice cold again, and we don't know, again, how much injuries played into that and Diaz struggles, but just stay healthy. And I don't need you to come out here with the 950 OPS, but just play consistent, play well enough to be the first name on the lips of Mike Elias and company when the need arises for someone to bring up.
So I'll put this out there as we kind of wrap up this discussion on the Tides. If there's one player that you feel like might be kind of an under-the-radar breakout type pick, or maybe a guy that struggled a little bit last year that you feel like is going to improve this year, who would it be?
As far as improve, I would say Kevin Smith for me. I think we were doing a little bit of digging. We kind of think we might know why he struggled a little bit last year. And as long as he got his head clear over the offseason, he's working with Justin Ramsey again. We're obviously huge fans of him as the pitching coach here. I could see him and getting adjusted to that ball. You don't know how much that played into it. So I think he has a chance to really earn back our trust as far as a reliable starting pitcher prospect, or maybe just a better relief prospect than he showed at the end of last season. And the under the radar guy that I think might really surprise some people, I'm going to go with Patrick Dorian. I think he really improved a lot from 2019 to 2021. He's a little bit older. He's not have the pedigree of a lot of the guys, but he has a great approach at the plate. He has developed some pull power that he hadn't shown before. So I think maybe he gets a chance at some point this season and surprises some people.
For a guy that I think is going to bounce back, I think Blaine Knight's going to put up better numbers than he did in his turn at Norfolk last year. He got to the Tides, and he really struggled to miss bats once he got there, but he had just had a kid. I think he was late in the year, and it had been a long season after a pandemic layoff in 2020. I think that if this is a guy that could be successful in a relief role, I don't know if the plan is to piggyback him or exactly how they're going to handle him at the start of this year, but the stuff is there for him to be successful. It really is. So I think that if he can, settle into a good routine, get a fresh start at Norfolk this year, he's going to fare better against AAA hitters. And I'm really, really interested to watch Cole Avila, minor league Rule 5 pick from the Texas Rangers system. This is someone who has gotten up good write-ups in the past. You look at his numbers last year, and what jumps out is that the walk rate was not very good. But again, this is someone who missed bats and, struggled a little bit at AAA, but it's 22 2/3 innings over a longer sample size. If he can cut back on the walks a little bit, I think he's a guy that, could be in the mix for a bullpen spot because, if the last few years are any indication, the Orioles are going to need bullpen help as the season goes on. So your hope is that depth at the top of the system is better than it was last year, which I think it is, but we need to see the games on the field first.
Completely agree. Uvila, Vespi, Almengo even is intriguing. Duplan had some success at the major league level last year. Pretty much everyone other than Connor Green and Ryan Hartman, I'm intrigued by. I'm very curious how they're going to use Blaine Knight, Peralta, Sedlock, and David LeBron, I think, is a little bit under the radar as a relief option as well. So I don't know if they're going to piggyback certain spots with like 3 or 4 innings apiece, or if they're just going to turn a Peralta, Knight, etc., fully onto 1-inning relievers and see how they do. But it's just very interesting to see how they're going to use these guys.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be excited to watch this. And we will be back on Monday with a live episode when we are joined by Nick again and John Mayo from MLB Pipeline. We're going to interview him about MLB Pipeline's assessment of the Orioles system, their top 100 prospect list, get a little bit of prospect coverage there before we jump into our annual opening day predictions. So we'll have that on the back half of the show next week. So a lot of good stuff coming up. In the meantime, continue to follow us on Twitter at BSL on the Verge. Check out Baltimore Sports and Life for all of the latest Orioles coverage, as well as college sports and football. Hop on the message board, join and discuss with fellow readers of the site, as well as some writers there. And before we wrap up, Bob, any final thoughts?
I hope listeners enjoy that interview as much as I did. Can't say thanks enough to Brad for coming on. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the season getting started. Looking forward to Monday's episode.
Yeah, absolutely. For Bob Phelan and Nick Stevens, this is Zach Spedden. You've been listening to On the Verge.
Today, we discuss Miro. Listen, when it comes to running client workshops, the dream, of course, is to get those creative juices flowing, right? But typically what ends up happening is thousands of hours get wasted because of poorly facilitated meetings. So I have Maya with me today. She's a consultant who runs Fortune 100 workshops, from leadership training to team building, and she has the insider tip on what makes things work. Maya?
Thank you, Jason. I've been doing this a long time. My number one tip is to bring everyone into that visual collaboration platform. So personally, I use Miro, and it's completely changed how I interact with the room. You have to give people a way to feel like they're in the room even when they're not. That's something you can do easily in Miro. Otherwise, they've seen the same slides and format 1,000 times.
Falling asleep, eyes glazing over, yawns, all that.
Exactly. When people follow me on the Miro board, everyone is literally going on a journey with me. We're adding thoughts, we're reacting, and we're voting for the best ideas. It's great.
Connective magic. I like it. That's MIRO.com.